Elliott, thanks for joining me in conversation today. Where in the world are you and what are you doing?
Well, hi, Natalie. It's good to see you again. I'm all the way over in Dubai this week for the largest IT conference in the world called Gitex. And it's absolutely amazing the technology that's on display here. Nearly everything here is talking in some way about AI or generative AI.
And before we dive in, what is the most impressive or shocking thing that you've seen there in terms of emerging technologies?
I'm really impressed with the way people have merged robotics with generative AI because a lot of people, I think they look at a robot and they think, oh, that must be AI. Well, probably most robots are not actually using generative AI. But nowadays, when you look at their ability to have a conversation with someone, probably behind the scenes, there's a large language model operating the robot a bit like a puppet, saying, okay, the next thing you need to say is this, this, and this. So seeing these technologies come together is absolutely amazing.
So embodied AI. Yeah, I mean, yeah, there's so many things racing through my head. But let's start where I always like to start these conversations.
Mhm.
And you can take this in any direction you want, given that you're a tech conference. And that's, what do you think is happening in the global human psyche if we use that frame of reference to play with?
What do I think is happening in the global human psyche
Yeah.
with regard to generative AI?
Let's go down that route. Yeah. Seeing as this is kind of like the main theme of our discussion today. Yes, go there.
Um, well, I think it depends on the point of view of the people who are creating AI and the people who are using AI and people who are not involved in it at all yet. I mean, one of the things I like to think about is when these new technologies come out, how do you enable communities or even whole countries to leapfrog from one point to another? So one thing we've learned from previous sessions is that, let's take part of emerging Africa. In emerging Africa, you may not have the ability to roll out infrastructure for plain old telephone systems with a wire going to everybody's house where you can make a telephone call. And then there was a disruptive technology came along, which was cell phones. And in that particular case, you suddenly enabled a company or a country to leapfrog the technology they're missing out on from plain old telephony systems up to mobile phones. And when you introduce a brand new technology, you often unlock new ways that the users of those can consume those. So in those kind of locations, what we found is that people began to adopt minutes on a mobile phone as a form of currency. If they wanted to pay something, they would say, well, I'll transfer 10 minutes from this account to this other account, and they could buy
Wow.
goods and services with that. And this was completely unexpected use of that kind of technology. But in many ways, the country that had access to that leapfrogged their competition or other places which didn't have access to that. And I think often if we look at technology from the point of view of North America or Europe or APJ, you may sometimes miss out on some really fascinating use cases or ways that different communities can get value from these kind of things. And I think to a certain extent, when you think about generative AI, you're really looking for use cases and change in people's psyche about how they think about these things. And let me give an example of that. AI is a huge umbrella term that basically can refer to anything that a computer does, which is similar to a human. So you might say, well, humans look at things and say, well, the AI version of that is computer vision, and computer vision's been around for ages. You might say, AIs can listen to things like the human does, and that's basically speech to text, for example. So those kind of things have been around for ages. But what's different with generative AI is generative AI, instead of processing existing data sets, there's a new approach, which is generating a constant stream of tokens. And these tokens might be words, could be letters, could be images, could be sounds, could be videos. But basically, you're creating something or content which never existed before. So to have people think about how to use these use cases, a lot of people were thinking, well, it's a new form of IT, isn't it? Maybe I should use it to reduce cost or improve efficiency or reduce risk. But I think if you look at that, you're probably missing out on a massive opportunity, because the organizations that I see the most successful in this are organizations that say generative AI enables us to create a business process or a process for citizens if you're a government service, which was previously completely impossible before. And once you start to look through that lens, you start to work out, well, what is the new art of the possible, things that I couldn't do. So in the world of policing, for example, you'd probably go to a police department and say, what if on Monday morning I would give you the equivalent of 1,000 new detectives who are going to join the team? What would you have those 1,000 new detectives do? That makes them think about IT and generative AI in a completely new way. If I say to a contact center manager, I'm going to give you 1,000 new contact center agents tomorrow, what would you do with those contact center agents? And this is where organizations start to become really creative about the art of the possible.
Fascinating. One of the things that was coming to my mind as you were saying about trading in minutes is that movie. I'm terrible at remembering names of movies, but there's that movie which is set in the future where everyone has access to like youthful bodies once you hit something like the age of 30, and then it's about trading in time. And there's a scene which always stuck with me where Olivia Wilde's character meets with her son, and they look like they're similar age, but she's obviously probably in her 40s, he might be in his 20s or something like this, and he's desperate to transfer minutes to her so that she can live, and she dies. And I was thinking, oh my god, as you were saying that, I was thinking, this is like, I know this is a bit early for this kind of conversation, but it does strike at something which is really interesting, which is the quality of attention and our ability to use our time wisely, which AI in good hands used thoughtfully hopefully gives us back that ability to attend to the things that really matter and to free up time. So speaking about ways in which we can augment and deepen and enrichen the human experience, at Dell, one of the key things that I know of that you guys focus on is human progress. So how can we use technology to help people in their lives and businesses?
That's
and You mentioned government services. What do you see as the roles and responsibilities of business using emerging technologies in shaping society? Because often, if we're thinking about responsible AI and guardrails and all of that stuff, governments can be quite slow. And yet we see that when businesses take a responsible stance, perhaps at some cost to themselves, customers respond, generally speaking, in really positive ways. So what are your thoughts around roles and responsibilities of businesses in responsible tech?
Yeah, it's an interesting area because it's a very complicated area. I mean, as you said, there may be certain gaps in legislation in certain parts of the world. And then there's this discussion that goes on about to what extent should a business close that gap or provide some kind of option. My general approach to look at this is to say that it's the responsibility of the IT provider is to give people choice and give people access so they can choose at what level do they want to engage with the IT and what level do they want to use these kind of solutions. But I think probably there is a minimum baseline where you would say, actually, if I'm going to publish a new large language model, I probably as a minimum baseline want to ensure that there's no bias towards protective characteristics, or there's no advocating of violence, or there's certain fundamental things that are probably consistent on any part of the world which you would want to enforce or certainly include as a feature in that kind of release. And then the question is, do you give people tools that can change that, or do you allow people to go beneath that baseline? And that is an ongoing discussion. I mean, you could go on to the special area of Hugging Face, which is for Dell, and you could download highly optimized large language models, which will run in the most efficient way on the Dell platform with NVIDIA GPUs and this kind of thing. But in all of those models, you really, really knew what you're doing and you wanted to, you could fine tune those models to remove some protections. So is it the responsibility of the manufacturer or the IT provider to actually block that kind of thing? Or do you say, well, there has to be some responsibility by the organization which is consuming it to use it in a responsible way? Or do you somehow work with the government of each area to say to them, are you aware of how IT could be used in different ways and what their relational threats are for that kind of thing? Because obviously you want to protect against threats, you want to protect against harm, you want to protect against abuse, and that kind of thing. So I tend to think that the difficulty right now is that it's a tall order for government departments to keep up with the rate of change, particularly in generative AI. If you looked at historically, before the world of clouds and multi-cloud and hybrid cloud and that kind of thing, IT professionals would probably keep up to date once a quarter. They would do some mandatory training, or the business would say, okay, this month we're going to give you training on X, Y, and Z. And government departments and legislators would have a similar kind of approach. And you could probably do that every 3 months. When cloud and multi-cloud came along, you needed to be up to date or having some kind of ongoing professional development every 4 weeks. And if you didn't do that, you're behind the game and things are going to move on. With generative AI, it's absolutely incredible. You literally need to be on top of it every 5 days. If you're not doing some kind of self-development or some kind of training or some kind of awareness every week, then you will not only fall behind your competition, but you will fall behind knowledge of all the opportunities that you could use for your organization. And I think that although we have this kind of constant pressure on the IT world, probably governments and legislators have similar kind of pressure to say, okay, what was the latest advance? What's the impact on this legislation? What legislation is now obsolete and how can we delete it? Do we ever remove any kind of legislation from the books? Or how do you even evaluate that much change? And do you need some kind of technology solution that says, hey, I've evaluated all the changes in the last 5 days that might affect legislation, and these are the top 20 items of law that would be affected. There probably needs to be some kind of automated technical solution which can help legislators keep up with the rate of change.
So using technology to help us regulate technology.
Yeah, I mean, you get similar things in the world of security. What's the new phrase everyone's using is catch an AI, you need an AI. There's certain things which will go beyond human capability. And I think people have a responsibility to work out, how they keep abreast of those changes and, the most efficient way to use them.
Hearing that, it makes sense based on the speed and scale at which these technologies operate and are advancing. And yet, at the same time, I'm also wondering about how one ensures oversight when, by virtue of the fact that it's so complex, humans can only work on what's being put out without. It's kind of like that. It's that transparency, the black box. Can you ever actually open it and figure out how it's given rise to specific outcomes? And so I wonder there, in terms of oversight, like how much oversight do we have if we're reliant on output from tech that we will increasingly be unable to understand?
Well, I think going forward, the expectation of the humans will change. I don't think there will be a requirement for a human to actually evaluate everything. But what there will be an expectation is that the humans have access to tools that enable them to do that. And those tools need to be able to keep up. I mean, we have really powerful solutions for things like highly secure computing approaches, where with a confidential computing approach, you start at one end and say, look, this is where the data came from. And I know that it was processed in this way. It was turned into a vector database. It was put into an AI, and the AI put out these details. If you can mathematically prove that chain all the way through, then you can give confidence to somebody that the lineage of the data, where the data came from, is accurate and reliable. So if you were in like a military situation, for example, and you are having decision-making software, you would probably want to prove mathematically that you knew where the data came from and what data is being taken into account for any particular calculation. Same for some software that might be flying a plane, for example. But is that realistic to do for the software that's going to design a new pizza topping for a chain of pizzas tomorrow based on what ingredients are in each restaurant? Well, maybe, maybe not. But there must be some kind of crossover where you say there's a certain responsibility around working out, number one, where did the data come from? And number two, what is actually possible for this AI solution to help?
Okay, so thinking about wondering how to discern hype, I suppose, fiction from reality and fact. Since ChatGPT and Claude and various different bots, generative AI platforms, bots, emerging technology, like all of this, there was a wave of public interest and access to these technologies last year of various stripes. Yeah. So given that we're all kind of guinea pigs in this sandbox, which is exciting, but also a bit like, okay, we're seeing in real time what can happen. What are your thoughts about where we might be on the Gartner hype cycle in terms of that initial excitement of where technology can go, and then there's a peak of expectation and the trough of disillusionment, and then this kind of calibration where we realize what the technologies that are emerging can and can't do and how to adjust for that in terms of societally, in terms of business, etc. Where do you think we are? And when I say we, maybe give us a sense, because you're an industry insider. And I've noticed when I ask people at conferences this question, the answer very much depends on whether people are taking it from the perspective of someone who works within this industry or people within a more public sphere who are testing it in a lighter kind of way and don't have such in-depth knowledge.
It's probably a difficult question to answer. I have to say that sometimes I see things in the media or in social media, and they relate to something that a technology company has been working on or a big customer has been working on. And I look at the announcement and I think, oh, that's surprising. They got that completely wrong.
So it's lost in translation.
Well, there's this people, you know, the kind of scenario, two people can look at the same thing and see a completely different picture in their mind. You do get a lot of that with generative AI. Or you see a kind of sneak release that somebody's put out as some kind of teaser, and you've probably got a pretty good idea of what they're referring to. But actually, the chain of discussion goes off in a completely different direction. And you think, oh my goodness, I didn't expect that. Like, for example, Microsoft released a really interesting addition for generative AI that they put on special Copilot laptops, which have fantastic functionality. But the way it was consumed by people who were commenting on it was to perceive it as a potential privacy risk.
Yeah, this is the one with
completely
recall.
Missed,
is that the one you're talking about?
Exactly, and they completely missed certain aspects of the technology or how it's intended to be used, and that took the conversation down a completely different route. And I think that happens quite repeatedly, and there are people who don't have a voice or don't have that ability to come back and set the record straight or correct those kind of things, just because of the nature of how we have this global communication ability now. So,
but do you not think that, I mean, that sounds like a UX problem as much as anything else, which is you design something, you put it out into the wild, and you don't necessarily know how it's going to be adopted and used. And then people use it in a way that's unexpected, but that still has a bearing on kind of guardrails that maybe should have been put in place with more thorough testing to begin with? Or do you think it's that these issues exist?
I don't know if it's a...
But then...
Yeah, I don't know if that's a UX problem. I think there's a problem of competing priorities. I mean, there's a whole community of people who are incentivized by finding problems with software and IT because they get paid to fix those or to squash bugs or to, highlight what they perceive to be problems. And then if you look at a typical organization, if there's such a thing, or a large enterprise, have those perceived problems actually been areas that would cause an issue for that business in the real world? Or did you actually, was the net effect of this that you took some functionality away from the business that could have used it to improve their revenue or reduce their costs or improve their margin or that kind of thing? So I think there are lots of, the problem which is in every organization or with every kind of product is there are always going to be competing KPIs somehow need to get resolved. And coming back to the Gartner hype cycle, I think that generative AI is one of these unusual parts of IT where you start the cycle and then you get up to the peak and then you actually get dragged back and the thing gets reset again and then you go forward and then you get dragged back again. And so, for example, you would have a look at something like ChatGPT 3.5 from a year ago or whenever it was, and at the time you'd say, wow, this is absolutely amazing, isn't that incredible? You get to ChatGPT 4 and you think, well, that was amazing. Well, but hold on, I already said 3.5 was amazing. So are they both amazing? Or is one less amazing than it was before? And so you've kind of dragged yourself back again on the hype cycle. And now we've got Strawberry. We've got Llama 3.2, which you can download and install on the server for yourself, which is as capable a frontier model as a closed source frontier model. You know, so people's expectations keep getting reset and pulled back, I think. And then you see the introduction of things like multimodal models. So an idea of a generative AI solution that can create an image But it turns out that in the process of creating a model that is really good at creating an image, they seem to have somehow improved the quality of text processing.
Huh.
So, well, how does that work? so these again, you're kind of resetting that hype cycle every time. I think the key thing that for organizations is that we can't just implement IT for the sake of it because it looks nice. And I have a particular structure which I talk to board level people about, is to get their head around how you can prioritize these kind of generative AI use cases. And that's I think giving that kind of structure to businesses in terms of different ways of thinking about it can be really useful.
So thinking about the ways in which organizations use AI, and this is a question that comes up a lot at the conferences that I speak at. It's like, how do we get people within organizations who have loads of stuff on their plate? Maybe they're worried about AI. Maybe they don't know where to start. You've always got like a super keen bunch. You're like, yes, I use it. I bring it to work every day. It's really lightened my workload.
Yes.
And then you have a large proportion of people who, for various different reasons, just don't have that connection with or playtime with the tech that's out there. And so there are lots of misconceptions around what it can do, what it can't do, how hard it is, how we like. And so what would you say to organizations, leaders within organizations who are faced with that challenge of getting people to get to know what AI can do and use it safely?
Well, I think the first key thing is actually trust your employees and give them access in the first place to just a vanilla, simple ChatGPT-like experience, but within the safe context of their organization. I think if you go to your employees and say, oh no, we're banning it, you must not put any company data into those kind of solutions, then people will ultimately find workarounds and probably they'll be doing it anyway. And that's what we don't. We'll give them a safe, secure way, putting company data into those kind of platforms. So just giving them inferencing access, I think, is really beneficial. And then you'll find that your users will find ways to improve their work through having access to that. So then there's this pressure now that builds up on the organization that says, well, we know for sure in the next 6 months our competitors will have access to technology. We know that users at home have the expectation that if they can get some of this technology on a mobile phone, then surely they should have it at work. We know that employers at work have got this expectation. So how do we provide like the next approach to generative AI? And so the approach that I normally recommend is to say, look, think about this in 3 different areas. The first area is to say, are you going to create something called a hero AI? And to me, a hero AI is when you look at a solution which is so absolutely amazing that the only way that could have possibly been implemented is using generative AI. So something we were talking about earlier, like a digital human that greets you as you walk into the emergency room of a hospital and helps you do triage in any language that you happen to speak in the hospital. Probably that digital human that appears on the monitor is being controlled by a large language model in the background, and it's responding to questions and answering questions. That can only have been built with generative AI. A customer service chatbot that becomes an expert on your customer service history, that can only have been built with generative AI. And for organizations who take that first approach and deploy one of these kind of hero AIs, you very quickly get employees to understand what generative AI can do. But is that the design pattern which is going to give you the biggest bang for your buck? And so if that's not the design pattern that could give you the biggest bang for your buck, what's an alternative approach? Well, another alternative approach would be to say, what we'll do is we'll take our core systems, our core production systems, and we will embed generative AI at key parts of a business process. So let me give you another example. Let's say we're in healthcare and a doctor wants to write a letter to another doctor about the patient they're treating, which is a very common thing, doctors writing letters to each other the whole time. The structure of these letters is always the same. It starts off with the patient's name, date of birth. It gives a summary of their medical history, gives a breakdown of the medication they're on, and then there's text underneath of the treatment plan. And you can imagine in a hospital record system, when the doctor's typed in their treatment plan, they click submit, and then instead of it sending that letter to the other doctor, maybe generative AI comes to life and says, wait a minute, let me just have a read through of that letter. And it reads through and it says to the first doctor, actually, there's a great treatment plan, but did you also think about this, this, and this? And the human doctor can review it and say, hey, that's a pretty good suggestion. I think I'll include that in my letter. They hit submit again, and the letter goes off. In that kind of scenario, the doctor was just using the production system that they all use every day, and they're totally familiar with, but generative AI actually helped them be more efficient without them realizing they even use generative AI. However, consider that kind of use case from the point of view of a CIO. If I go to the IT director of a huge NHS trust in the UK, or a big hospital in the Middle East or something, and say to the CIO, you should consider updating your production medical record system to incorporate all these changes, the reaction could be, wow, I've got a plan for it, I've got a budget for it, I've got to raise a change request, I've got to test it, I've got to back it out if it goes wrong. It's a mission critical system, do I really want to change that? So now you're in this kind of pressure between, you know you can get fantastic things with generative AI, but do you want to update your core systems? So that's the second approach. Is there a better approach, Cindy? So we talked about Hero AI, we talked about updating production systems. Perhaps there's something in the middle. And that thing in the middle, I'd say, is using something which nearly every company has got today, which they may not realize they've got, which is called robotic process automation. With robotic process automation, you basically set up a computer that pretends to be a human. And how does that thing know what to do? Well, of course, you're controlling it with generative AI. In fact, what you can do is you can deploy a whole team of AIs to work together like a team. So you might say, right, I'll have, let me give you an example that we were working with a customer recently. So imagine you're running a water utility company, and you're the manager of a contact center, and in your contact center, you've got 2,000 people answering phone calls from customers. And all of a sudden, you get inundated with calls saying, oh, the water pressure in my area has suddenly dropped, and I can't get enough water out of the taps. What do you do about that? Well, probably you call up one of your supervisors and say, can you investigate why there might be reasons of why the water pressure has suddenly dropped?
Yeah.
They say, well, we've checked our back-end systems and everything's fine. And then they do some research on the internet and says, oh, hold on, there's actually an event going on. And I don't know, have you heard of this, a festival called the Water Bomb Festival?
No.
It's an unusual use case that we came across. So it turns out there's a thing called the Water Bomb Festival. And at the Water Bomb Festival, in various hot locations around the world, because these locations are really hot, then while they're playing Korean pop music, they also spray the crowd of thousands of people with ridiculously large water cannons which shoot water up in the air, and they give out water pistols to everyone, and everyone's shooting each other with water pistols. Everyone's having a fantastic time, but you're getting through a lot of water.
Yeah.
So did anyone tell the water company that they're about to start shooting water up into the air in a hot country? So fantastic festival, but what we can do from a generative AI point of view is say, we'll have a project manager AI that's going to work out why the customers are calling up the contact center. We'll have an AI that can transcribe calls into text, and then we'll have that AI pass it to another AI that can write a summary of every call. It's all in real time. And then as soon as the call's finished, you take the summary and you say to another AI, what do all of these calls have in common? And the AI says, oh, there's low water pressure in this area. That passes it to another AI and says, why could there be low water pressure? Go and write some Python code to go out onto the internet and scrape news sites to find out, are there any events coming on? It runs a Python code, goes out to the internet, does a search, works out that the Water One Festival started 6 hours ago. It comes back and then it writes a report for the contact center manager saying, this is probably the reason. And then it passes that to another AI, which writes a report which can be sent out by email to all of the 2,000 agents in the contact center saying, if somebody calls you up and asks you about low water pressure, then here's the briefing of what you're going to say to that person. So in that particular use case, we've implemented critical business process without changing any production systems, without creating any hero AIs, but we've taken a team of AIs all collaborating together to answer one simple question that a human asked, which is, why did the water pressure drop in this part of the city?
That is fascinating.
This kind of way of consuming generative AI takes a different way of thinking, and that's to me is the most fascinating area, to see what people will come up with when you put together teams of AIs to collaborate together and then give them access to production systems as if they were a human.
So there's lots of things I want to ask you about that. One of the things I'd like to ask you about, but maybe come back to this towards the end, is around the future and agents and secondary economies of versions of ourselves that we put to work while we're sleeping. Another one is around redundancy for mission critical systems. One of the things that, and this is not connected to AI, but it is connected to technology. And so I'm very curious what your thoughts are here. So a few years ago, 2 years ago. So my partner's from Costa Rica, and he was telling me about a big outage that happened in the medical system in Costa Rica. It was hacked. And because everything is digitized, loads of people's treatments were blocked, including life-saving surgeries. You know, you can imagine the chaos that can cause. And one of my questions is, and this might sound like a really Luddite thing to say, but what are the backup plans when digital systems fail? Because we see that outages, it's part of the parcel, right? It's kind of like, it's going to happen at some point or other. So rather than kind of blaming the systems that are in place, because I think there is a fragility to any system, the question is, how do we adapt when digital systems do have to run on infrastructures, energy sources? You know, if there's like the Milton hurricane that just dropped, if there are unexpected outages that last for periods of time or disruptions to the supply chain that then have impacts that are unforeseen, what are the backup plans? Like, do we need to have analog backup plans, or can that, like, what do you think around that? Like, how do we build more resilient systems?
Yeah, I don't think we need analog backup plans, but there's always a question of, is a business process or an IT process good enough? So there's always like a good enough test. And so in the medical world, there's a pretty high bar of something is good enough. If it's in the retail world, you might be able to get away with different approaches. So we can talk a bit about that. In general, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is saying it's not a question of if it happens, it's going to be a question of when that happens. And it's not only in developing countries, that could be in any location, because it might be due to a cyber attack or power failure or anything like that. So if you start to think, okay, this is definitely going to happen at some point, what do we do about it? One of the things that I would advocate is to take the key business processes like the ones you described, and you actually create a wrapper around them. And you have an automated process that lifts up those key business processes, everything you need to operate them, and it puts them across an air gap, and it puts them into a location which is completely isolated from the rest of the environment. And if you do that before the key event happens, then you're in a pretty good place, because you've got this kind of sheltered harbor approach where all of that capability to run your absolute mission critical things is protected. And it doesn't matter if you destroy the entire infrastructure, because you've still got this other capability. What I've seen in the real world is organizations will have an event like that, and then they'll pick up the phone to an IT supplier and say, panic, what do we do? And someone will say, well, do you have a clean room? Do you have an air gap security? And sorry, I'm being given my 5-minute warning. They will say, do you have an air gap solution? And if the answer is no, then you're really, it's a real tall order to rebuild a production system that can take over, especially in a time of crisis. Because one of the things you see when people are under pressure is that their decision-making skills suddenly disappear. And what you want to do is have in advance some pre-made decisions of actions that you will take, like emergency actions, like a pilot might have an emergency checklist, things that you would go through when that happens. And so the other thing I see is that when an event like that happens, even the organizations that have the emergency checklist say, oh, for some other reason, I don't trust the emergency checklist, and they throw it out the window and start making up actions of what they should do. And so when we're talking about this and we're not under pressure, you might think that's a crazy thing to do. When you're under pressure and the phone's ringing and things are on fire and you've lost data and this kind of thing, then these kind of unexpected scenarios do actually happen in the real world. So, my thought is encapsulate your key processes, work with a trusted partner to lift those up and put them in this kind of sheltered harbored approach. And then you'll be ready for when that event happens on any particular day.
So I know that you've got a small amount of time left because you're in a crazy hectic environment.
I'm
I
really
do
sorry.
want to ask about. Go on.
We can pick up at finish this at another time if you want to, because I think we're having a great discussion. It would be nice to carry this on.
I want to ask 2 more questions and then see where we go, because I know you need to leave. So one of them is around the biggest challenges, the biggest risks that you see in terms of safely innovating, adopting, and rolling out generative AI and what comes next? Because I also want to ask you about future technologies, because Gen AI is just one of the emerging technologies.
Okay.
And the other is around agents and how AI, in particular agents, could completely transform the workforce. That's another question. It's like, oh my God, my job's going to get taken over. And Goldman Sachs came up with this really, in my mind, quite unhelpful headline last year where they said 300 million jobs are going to be degraded or lost by AI. And then you actually look at the results, you're thinking, that hasn't translated in the way that they predicted, and certainly not at the scale. So what are your thoughts? Let's go with agents first, in the ways in which agents could be harnessed by people, and how it might change the jobs market and how we work. And what are the sort of concerns and possibilities there?
I think it's natural that people's roles will change over time. I think the question is to what
Yeah.
extent do people get benefit from generative AI? And I think a good aiming point would be when you get to the stage where you've enabled people to have like a team of AIs that are effectively working for them. And a comment you made earlier was quite interesting, which is that what are the AIs doing when you're asleep? You want to feel confident that whilst you're asleep, you've configured the AIs in such a way that they are aligned with your ethical beliefs and your frame of reference, and you have complete confidence that they would only do what you would do in the real world as well, albeit 1,000 times quicker and 1,000 ways parallel and that kind of thing. I think it's very important to get that kind of confidence. How do you get that confidence? Well, it might be a case of use it and see what happens. It might be a case of put in place guardrails. It might be a case of when you create these agents, you start off by giving them functions that they can call. And these functions typically will be read-only functions. So if I'm in a big organization and I've got a huge customer database, I might create an AI agent that says, if somebody gives you an account number, here's the API call that you make to go and look up all the customer details. So we give the agent that kind of superpower, if you like, to go and dip into a live customer database. But what we will not give it is the ability to delete that record or to update that record or to just email the customer without my permission. So I do think there's like a gradual step of new types of ways of using generative AI that organizations will have to get their head around. And it's probably a progression that starts out saying, look, in the last 100 emails that I asked the AI to write to my customer, I actually just approved every single one. So maybe when I've got to that stage, I can have confidence that then email 101, I'm going to allow it to just send it on by itself. I think there probably needs to be some kind of approach taken with nearly every change or every superpower that you give to an AI that's going to operate on your behalf. But there's certainly a skill for a human to be able to know how to orchestrate that and manage that. In the same way, there's a skill for a human manager managing a team of humans, which you don't just come out of university and you learn in 6 months. It probably takes part of a career to learn that. There's probably an analog with digital systems where their roles will change to be orchestrating these things, a bit like a conductor at the front, actually having the AIs work in the most efficient way.
Okay, and so before we go to the last question then, what do you think are the biggest challenges and risks around AI and emerging technologies in general? To give you a bit of freedom to throw a spanner of the works if you want to.
The biggest risks in these technologies. I think for large organizations, there is an absolute fear of missing out. So there's this huge competitive pressure saying, you have to get onto this, you've got to consume this. Business leaders saying, we need this for our business immediately. And that's absolutely understandable. But then sometimes someone from an IT area will come along and say, oh, well, in order to do this, you've got to put into your data, you've got to put it into a new format, you've got to copy it up to a cloud, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's probably not the right approach. I think the risk there is that those organizations spend money and then ultimately do miss out and their competition will get ahead of them. And so I think it's important to classify, or first of all, even make a list of all the ways you're going to benefit from generative AI, like a huge use case catalog. But then take a big red pen to that use case catalog and strike out the use cases which are going to take you 6 months to implement, or you have to update your data, or you have to copy your data. The ideal thing is to take the AI solution and move it close to where your data is today, or where your business processes are today, or where your users are today, and then work out which of the use cases I can implement without having to do lots of extra activity. Because probably those use cases will provide the funding that we'll then use to mushroom out to the next level of use cases and the next level of use cases after that. So,
and from the perspective of like the old, sort of just general people going to work, doing their thing, what are the real biggest risks? Like to puncture through the hype bubble and say, okay, these are the things that actually you do need to upskill on or that could pose a threat, maybe from a societal perspective in general terms.
I think the main thing that I would say is to keep an open mind. I attended an event a few months back where there were hundreds of architects. The architects said, oh, there's no way generative AI is going to do what I do. If I do building calculations, I create visualizations, etc., etc. And I had a hard time trying to persuade all of those people in the same room that thought the same way that actually that might not be the best way of looking at it. Why don't you start off with the idea that the AI absolutely can do that? How are you going to get benefit from it? Don't have this kind of clashing of minds where you're suddenly now in a competition with some kind of technical solution. Isn't it a better use of your time to say, right, now I understand that there's highly likely that this will be producing designs for a new house in the next 10 seconds, that I work out how I can get benefit from that as a modern architect designing modern solutions with modern systems. And I think if you take that approach from that industry, you can apply it to nearly any industry.
So the biggest risk is saying, okay, I'm actually protected, and then not engaging with it and saying, okay, if I start from the assumption that pretty much what I do can be replicated, where does that leave me? But then we've got the whole overwhelm thing. So maybe that's where we dip into a different conversation. So to end then, what are the biggest areas or breakthroughs that give you a sense of excitement and possibility of how things could transform through these technologies?
Well, I absolutely love the technologies that augment what humans do at the moment. So imagine if you could give a human some kind of superpower. So the obvious one is giving people unlimited memory, or absolutely like
do we really want
picture
that?
perfect.
I don't want that.
I don't know. I mean, it's if you ever had a conversation with someone and they remind you of a fantastic time that you had that you might have forgotten about, or a really enjoyable experience. I mean,
but then do you want to remember all the bad stuff too? Like, I think loss of memory sometimes in certain contexts is a blessing.
Well, yes, probably with bad memories, you probably want to process them and work out what did I learn from that and then try and forget the original memory.
Yeah.
So yes, but again, that might be a way that you configure your AI that's going to help you. I quite like the idea of looking back on a meeting that I had 3 months ago where somebody asked for 100 items of actions, and we're thinking, well, what happened since then and how does that fit in with the other meetings that I've had? That kind of augmenting human performance, I think, is absolutely fascinating. I also really like the fact that although generative AI is clearly not human, it can replicate human capabilities so well in some areas that can be really positive for society. So, for example, if you look at social issues around loneliness or support for elderly people, support for vulnerable people, where you suddenly give them access to services that were previously impossible to deliver. I mean, take, for example, mental health. If you take the number of people who are suffering from mental health problems in a particular country, you might say, well, the ideal solution is to give them one mental health expert per patient and they can have one-to-one treatment. That's never, ever going to be realistic in any kind of community. But can you actually build impactful solutions with generative AI that effectively are on call at any moment for a mental health patient to have a discussion with them or get reassurance or improve their confidence or process things from their past in a different way? I'm looking forward to getting access to all those kind of technologies.
I agree. I also have reservations. I was recently giving a talk in the Philippines, and one of the things that they talked about was this particular kind of AI, which was able to, in real time, reduce the accent of local Filipino workers in call centers when talking with American customers. And this was to reduce the amount of abuse that they would experience in these calls. And my heart just sank. And I just thought, like that you're firefighting. Exactly. That's my point. Like that it reduces in the short term the mental health strain and impact and abuse that these people are kind of facing, but it doesn't solve the issue. And so one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how can we use technologies such as AI to help us to make well systemic hurts that then lead to these particular outcomes like loneliness, like mental health crises, so that, we're not just using AI in the short term, which is a great stopgap, but we're also using it to address the root issues and create a more flourishing society for all of us where possible.
And it comes back to your original question: is whose responsibility is it to do that?
And whose do you think it is?
Exactly. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that a government-type organisation should fully embrace.
Yeah.
Even if you, how do you value these things? Do you value them on how much money you would have saved a health service, or do you value them in a different way to say, look what we've done to the population to improve their mental health, or to improve their quality of life, or to give them access to new contacts and ways of living their life that they never had access to before. So
yeah.
I think if you want to live in a society where you have those kind of benefits, then it should be responsibility of governments to look at exactly those kind of frameworks and not just be driven by trying to put out whatever the latest fire is.
So if you want to hear more about any of the themes we've talked about today, we'll be live in London for the Dell event in November. I've already given the details in the intro. We'll also paste them in the show notes below. What are you most excited about at this upcoming event, Elliott?
Well, Dell Tech Forum is a fantastic event. It takes place in London every year. And at that event, you'll be able to see the latest and greatest technology in the world of multi-cloud, cyber, client-type computing, edge solutions, and of course, the big thing that everyone's talking about, generative AI as well. It's going to be a fantastic event. And perhaps we can meet you guys there and see what you think in person.
Brilliant. I'm looking forward to trying some of this stuff out and to raising some awkward questions, which I love to do.
Let's run some of the demos.
Yeah. Well, Elliott, thank you. It's been enlightening, and looking forward to chatting more with you in November.
Really good to see you again. Thank you.